Hi philosophers, welcome to Hume Module 3. We're getting through Hume at a cracking pace here. Just to quickly recap, in our previous module we discussed how Hume argues that we commonly confound identity and diversity. So with things that are actually different objects because they've changed, we often so they're diverse, we tend to still think they're the same.
Yeah.
Is what Hume argues. And Hume also says that not only do we tend to ascribe an identity to them when actually they're diverse, but in order to kind of justify ourselves for that mistake, we often make up what he calls a fiction. So a fictional principle, so something
kind of like a construct. So my class we spoke a lot about constructs.
Yep. We create some kind of construct to give ourselves a reason for thinking that two different things have the same identities. For example, the idea of the self might be one of these fictions, or the soul.
Cool.
So the rest of Module 3 and Module 4, we're going to go through these kind of 6 examples that Hume gives to demonstrate how we make this mistake in everyday life, how we confound identity and diversity. And here on this slide, he's just saying that, if you're not already convinced by what I've said, I'm going to prove it from daily experience by showing that objects which are variable or interrupted and yet are supposed to continue the same are such only as consist of a succession of parts. So he's saying, I'm going to show you some specific examples where objects are actually different and they're just connected together by some kind of relation, but where we accidentally think that they're the same.
Yeah.
Now, I thought that it would be good at this point to stop, and you can see here I've underlined these 3 words.
Yep.
Resemblance, contiguity, or causation. Now, we've previously, I think, talked about the fact that Hume thinks that diverse objects are connected together by a relation. In other words, like some kind of relationship. So, like, to go back to the Play-Doh example, if I have a bit of Play-Doh and then take a tiny bit away from it, Hume would say those 2 objects are actually diverse, but we tend to think that they're the same because they resemble each other. They're connected by a relationship of resemblance. Do you get that?
Yep.
Resemblance means similarity,
Yep.
Another relationship that can trick us into thinking that diverse things are actually the same. Another relationship that Hume says might trick us into thinking that things have the same identity when actually they're diverse is contiguity. We don't really need to focus too much on this one because he kind of glosses over it in the text. Contiguous basically means touching, so contiguity means like related in space. And the third one is causation, which means one thing causing another. So if one thing is the cause of another thing, we're more likely to think that those 2 things are identical. He gives a good example of this later on, which is like an oak tree, which would begin as a very small plant but turn into a huge oak tree.
Yep.
The small plant kind of causes the growth, into that huge oak tree, and therefore we're more likely to confound those 2 things into the one identity.
Cool. Okay, so the first example is about a mass of matter, which is something I think we've touched on in another podcast and also maybe in class, to do with another mind map. But basically what he's saying with this is that if you have like a mass of matter like Play-Doh, which Misfits has spoken about, and you take away a tiny part of it, you clearly in your head, what he's saying here is, that it's a really small and inconsiderable part. You clearly know that it's been subtracted. You've seen it, you've seen it taken away, But because it's such a silly small amount, you don't bother to really take it into account. And what this bottom paragraph is saying, that it's actually even that your mind is just lazy and it doesn't properly think about, because the mass looks so similar, you just kind of, and so that's the whole resemblance idea, I guess. You just skim across it. So it's like the transition that it refers to is a really easy one because the thinking is really easy because it's looking at a very similar piece of
Yeah, I like this
Later.
quote here. The passage of the thought is so smooth and easy that we scarce perceive the transition, as in we barely perceive the change. And therefore we're apt to imagine that it's nothing but the same object.
Cool.
So the second example that Hume gives kind of builds on the first one a little bit. Bear with me here. What he says is that, he basically is reflecting on the fact that isn't it odd that with some masses of matter, say for example the Earth, it's huge, obviously. So with the Earth, if we added a mountain to the Earth, we would still be inclined to think that it was the same thing. And the reason for that is because of the proportion. So the mountain is very insignificant compared to the size of the Earth. So we add that mountain on, we still think it's the same object, not a diverse object. However, if we had something much smaller, he doesn't use the example of a tennis ball, but I've just added that in. If we had something much smaller like a tennis ball, if we added something quite small onto that, like, I don't know, a pencil or something.
A dot, do you mean?
No. If we added something like relatively small.
Well, a pencil's quite big.
But it's much smaller than a mountain. So if we added, let's just go with the pencil. If we added a pencil onto a tennis ball, we might think that the identity of the tennis ball was changed.
Yes, we would.
Yes, okay, yeah. So he's saying, isn't that odd that we can add a massive mountain onto the Earth and think it's not changed, and add a small, tiny pencil onto a tennis ball and think that it is changed?
Okay.
So can you see what he's trying to demonstrate with this example?
Not completely. No.
Well, he's basically saying this shows that it's all in the smoothness of the transition in our mind as to whether we think something is the same or not. Our mind is not actually making an accurate judgment about whether something is an identical object.
Yeah.
Because if it was making an accurate judgment, it would obviously say the Earth is a different object if it has a whole huge mountain added to it.
Yeah.
But because the Earth is so big, the transition between the Earth without the mountain and the Earth with the mountain is very smooth, and therefore we're apt to imagine that it's the same object. So again, the point is just, it has more to do with our mind being lazy than with the actual identity of the things that we're looking at.
Yeah.
So here's another example, example 3. There'll be 3 more examples in the next module. Here's another example that Hume uses to prove that our ideas about identity are more to do with our lazy minds than with any kind of intrinsic principle. Yeah? So this one, he's saying, if a change in any considerable part of a body destroys its identity, so if any part of something is changed, the identity immediately is destroyed and it becomes diverse.
Yeah.
But isn't it interesting that where the change is produced gradually and insensibly, so gradually and in a way that we can't really tell, that's what insensibly means, we are less apt to ascribe to it the same effect. So if, for example, with the...
what about like a sandcastle?
That's a good example.
Okay, a sandcastle, and a wave comes along and suddenly knocks over half the sandcastle.
Yep.
That's fine.
No, so in that situation, we're probably going to think
we're going to think
identity's
it's gone.
been gone.
Yeah.
Yep.
But if just over the course of a day you've built your sandcastle and bits and pieces have been blowing away in the wind, the grains of sand slowly and slowly, and at the end of the day it probably actually does look quite different, but you wouldn't even really probably think that. And you would just think it's the same sandcastle.
Perfect example, Tim. Like, we're going to think that that is the same sandcastle, even though the same effect has actually happened to it, but more gradually.
Yeah.
So again, can you see how I was using this to prove that it's all about the ease of the transition in our mind as to whether we think something is the same?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would just say, like, in terms of thinking about where this fits in his overall thing, so we know that he's proven his kind of idea that it's a bundle of perceptions, that the self if anything, is a bundle of perceptions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And he's now going, well, why though do we... He's trying to answer the question of why do we ascribe identity to things?
Mm-hmm.
And he's saying to us, well, we're confusing identity with diversity. And I think all these examples just go to that. They basically are saying you suck at figuring out identity. Clearly, in all these examples, you're putting identity onto actual very diverse things and labeling it with identity. Sometimes you recognise they're diverse, like if the wave knocks over half the sandcastle, then yes, that you've seen that's diverse. But other times, when the sandcastle's completely changed, you're giving it the same identity.
Yep.
When it's clearly diverse. So he's saying, okay, you're actually seeing all these diverse things, and I guess ultimately all those diverse things are just all the different perceptions.
Yeah,
well.
and that's what. So it's
So
supporting
it all
his
kind of
idea
links back
that.
eventually to this idea that it's all just a bundle of perceptions.
Yep, and there's nothing that really holds us together.
Yeah.
It's just all in our minds.
Yeah.
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 Cool. Yeah. Okay, so that's the end of Module 3. We'll be back with Module 4 and 3 more examples.